I want to touch on the old growth type. I'm not really talking about the classic old growth forest, but characteristics of an old growth forest, or forests that begin to get an exceptional amount of complexity, dead, standing, dead material on the ground, larger trees. That next cohort, that development of that the second cohort is now beginning to mature itself and enter in trees that die and fall and create a big gap. You get regeneration in the understory, shrub components, and also young trees. So beginning to get very complex, and it has its own set of management challenges. Here's another photo. This is actually from Henry Island. This is an unmanaged, I would say, old growth stand. The large and widely spaced Douglas firs show evidence of fire, and at one time being very open. You see the large relic limbs in the low canopy strata position. Here's another shot. I think this is from Stewart. Let's say an old growth type. We have that. This is from Orchid. This is turtleback. A few widely spaced large Douglas fir. There's cedar. There's hemlock. There's trees that are 30, 40 years old. There's trees that are 80. There's some of those Doug fir beyond 200. So the characteristics: slower volume growth and a little bit slower rate of productivity. You get, in many ways, a decline in timber quality. Certainly for our local use. Larger trees are difficult to handle. They tend to have internal fractures, resin pockets. The development phase that I wanted to emphasize is the formation of gaps. Gaps and mostly arising from trees that are suffering from decay or wind or just old age and are falling down. So that gives you a sense of the structural complexity. Go ahead. In terms of management options, if your objectives are to grow and harvest merchant materials and maintain healthy and productive Douglas fir on site. And the caveat here is that all of those, I wouldn't want to recommend harvesting all of the old growth type stands that are out there. In fact many of the legacies and features that we enjoy and are important ecologically are those old growth features. However, for a narrow suite of stands that have those characteristics and have those complexities, there are a few options. So, initiate a new cohort. That means sort of reestablish that next generation. And there are a couple techniques. There's a shelter wood that's been around for a long time. There's a seed tree, which is probably more frequently applied here in the county in some places. And there's a patch cut and plant. So these are, I'm not going to put too much time on these, but I want to emphasize that that we have a fair amount of those complex and old growth type stands out there, and they're a challenge to manage. And I have some photos here. This is not from the San Juan Islands. Most of you will recognize. This is an example of a sheltered wood system, and that's a series of usually 3 cuts that come in initially to spur some regeneration in the understory. Secondary is to remove most of that overstory, which is then marketed, and lastly you take almost all of the overstory off. And so the goal there is to increase your timber quality over this 3-phase cut and to initiate a healthy young stand, new stand.
And the time frame is like 20, 25 years?
A little shorter than that, maybe 10, 15 years, yeah. Lastly, and this is sort of akin to those old growth types, is what I would call cut over stands. I've seen a fair amount of examples of, I would call it a legacy of high grade, or legacy of sort of pick the low-hanging fruit, take the valuable trees, and leave. Or, grab one load of material and get out. Stuff that you're left with a lot of small trees, a lot of defective trees, or slow-growing trees. And what do you do? How do you proceed? And the short answer is it's site-specific, and you have to see what's there. And ideally, there's ways to thin and manipulate, maybe plant, to bring stuff up to a high level of productivity. Often, other times, you may have to start fresh, which basically means remove most of that overstory and plant. So essentially, there's another example, of something that's probably been high-grade harvested, 2 or 3 times, and we're not left with much that I would consider quality or has much of a chance to grow and become usable timber. And that's not always our objective, but if that is our objective, we have a couple of options. Oops, one back, please.
You wanna go back?
Yep. Essentially, we can leave as it is and just let it grow and be a forest, and it has plenty of habitat value as that. Or, like I mentioned, a heavy non-commercial cut, there may be really nothing there that's merchantable or viable, and this may be an out-of-pocket expense to follow up with a planting and to reinitiate that new stand. Or you may have a large patch cut and you may capture some of that value enough to conduct the work and follow with the planting. My summary for this is essentially, number one, you got to have a plan and define your long-term goals for your piece of property, for your site. Good access cannot be overstated. You got to get to it if you want to manage it. You got to get to it if you want to understand or make an assessment. Rich is going to talk more about hazardous fuels, but conduct an assessment and prioritize where your management actions will have the most effect. Manage where needed. Assess density often to be able to manage density or thin when it's appropriate or when best needed. Maintain appropriate species for the site. Douglas fir is great, we have a lot of it, it doesn't grow well everywhere. Same thing for red cedar or hemlock or grand fir. You really need to plan for regeneration. We are in a phase in the county where there are a lot of 80, 90-year-old stands and few young, vigorous stands. I want to emphasize that large, old-growth trees and wildlife trees should be retained for important ecological function, and you need to think about the long term.
So when you're up north, you're going by a mountainous hillside, and there's an odd-shaped clear cut in the middle of the mountain. What's that about?
You're talking on the mainland?
Yeah, mainland.
That's I'll touch on clear cuts. So
You're going to cover all my questions. Thank you.
well, and that's part of it. Carson's doing forestry stuff when it comes to money, and then the money impact of logging. We'll touch a lot of that in my slides, which will take Carson's. We'll put it all together. I'm kind of last, so it's like a teacher beating it into you in school. I'll kind of cover some Kai's, some Carson's again, and then we'll tie it together with the money side of things. And that is why you get patch cuts, call them checkerboards on the mainland. And we'll touch on why that happens and why it doesn't happen here. Besides the fact that the Friends would lynch us if we checkerboard turtleback.
Would you say in general that, it seems to me that the trees in San Juan County grow really slowly compared
Yes.
to, and even between the islands, I think Lopez is probably slower than over here. I feel like our trees don't get as big.
It depends a lot on the ground type. Our ground type's very variable. As for what trees we grow, we're very unique. We grow madrona, we grow lodgepole pine from the top of the mountain to the water. It's an elevation tree, it shouldn't be growing next to the water. We do a lot of things that you don't see growing until you're way down the coast. We grow a lot of things that aren't supposed to. It has to do with the rain shadow effect and our soils. But a lot of it has to do with the past logging. We'll touch on that next.
Yeah, and you think
section.
about your most productive sites on Lopez, they're all ag fields now.
Yeah.
Those are your deeper soil sites. They probably got big trees on them at one point. Yeah.
That
You could,
only keep
I
on-
just have a few photos here that, go ahead. This is another site off of Dolphin Bay where it was primarily thin from below, commercial thin. And this was with Island X with operators, about 40 acres in size. And they're shovel logging, that is an excavator with a grapple. And that's my last slide. So any more questions or any questions that folks have?
I have one question.
Yeah.
You were using the word undesirable species, and
Yeah.
is that in reference to if you're
That's-
only interested in timber?
Yeah, so again, that's a good question. What's undesirable for one person may be desirable for another person. Depends on your site, depends on your objectives. If you're trying to maximize timber value and maybe resiliency and in the face of drought or insects, for most sites it's probably going to be Douglas fir. And you look around at the stumps, you look around at the big stumps, most of them are Douglas fir. So other sites will be fine and grow cedar or hemlock or grand fir very well. So it kind of depends on your site. So, yeah, absolutely.
I got one question.
Yeah.
Maybe a little off base, but what's the minimum amount of land you need to get funding? Or you can get funding?
Well, like
Federal,
for
state,
like one of the
for a
well, there's
forestry plan.
the two programs that our county oversees that give breaks on your land taxes, timber open space and designated forest land. Timber open space, the minimum is 6 acres, and they'll take out an acre if you have a house on that. And designated forest land, same thing, 20 acres. Yeah. Eric?
Several of your management recommendations include planting.
Yeah.
Now for that, what would you suggest? Are mainland nursery stock seedlings appropriate out here, or better to find local seedlings?
What's available now, it's all broken up in seed zone provinces, I think they call it. So when I go to the state nursery, I will first see if they have any from the San Juans. They usually don't, but they have zone 211, which I think includes San Juan, Woodby, and like Port Angeles. So you want to get as close to as much local genetics as possible. But if there were a local supply of seed from the San Juans, that would be best. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been seed collected out
Would
here.
it be worth it for somebody to
It might
try
be.
to set up something
Yeah.
like that? Is there enough
Yeah.
restoration or replanting, I
It
should
might
say?
be. Yeah, it would be a challenge to compete with the prices for some of the bare root seedlings are 59 cents a piece.
Yeah.
But by the time you get them out here, it might be worth a little more or something. But yeah, it would be good. Ideally, we'd have some local genetics. So. Yeah.
Any other questions for Carson? And he'll be obviously with us the whole day, so you have a chance to come back and revisit.
Well,
What's your assessment of the fire hazard status in general on Arcus now? Is that a major concern as far as?
that's like a 30-minute cup of coffee and several croissants. But it's definitely a nuanced. I would have a long, lengthy, nuanced response. It varies place to place, and yeah, I'm not going to put a one-liner on that one. It's complicated.
I think there's just one topic that I want to underscore that Carson's brought up a couple points, and since I come from off island and I live in a much more productive forest zone down in the Olympia area, it's something I have to keep adjusting my perspective on when I come up to the San Juans, and that is the natural understory regeneration of trees across the islands here. What I found in walking through dozens of different forests now is that under that dense canopy, as Carson had pointed out in some slides, you'll get a lot of natural regeneration of these shade-tolerant trees, western hemlock, grand fir, cedar, and those trees will regenerate on all different kind of soils, from the wetter soils down in the lower of the landscape profile to up on hill slopes. Carson had asked that quiz, had a little quiz question there about, what is one of the biggest drivers for your silviculture? That's your long-term regeneration plan. What's the future of your forest? If we are just strictly doing light thinning and maintaining a fairly dense canopy in the forest, again, all you're going to get is the regeneration of these shade-tolerant trees by and large in the understory, but they may not be appropriate for the site. If you're on a hill slope, if you're on a ridge, if you're on a south-facing dry site, those trees may regenerate just fine, but the question is how long are they going to be viable on that site? And it may be that they'll get to a certain age, 30, 35, 50 years, and then start dying off. They just are not capable of supporting themselves on very, very dry, droughty soils, especially with increasingly dry summers. So again, you have to think about the right tree for the right site. And for those dry sites, Carson's been mentioning that Douglas fir really is one of the most appropriate trees. You're not going to get Douglas fir to regenerate naturally in a dense canopy or beneath a dense canopy. It is moderately, somewhat shade tolerant, but you have to open up the canopy quite a bit to get Douglas fir to regenerate or use small patch cuts. So again, if we're thinking long-term in our forest and the site is right for Doug fir, you want to adjust your silvicultural strategy to regenerate Douglas fir, and then you may need to be coming in and manually dealing with some of these species, hemlock wren fir in particular, that are not necessarily appropriate to the site. It could mean pre-commercial thinning or coming in early and cutting those out in order to support Douglas fir. They'll also be, if you do have an open enough canopy where Doug fir can regenerate, oftentimes those shade-tolerant species will be much more vigorous in the short term and can outcompete the Douglas fir. So Carson had mentioned some of the management strategies in young stands, at age 20, 25, getting in and being very proactive. To me, one of the most important things to keep in mind is just being active managers of our forests. Passive management can result in all sorts of issues, and non-management, and all sorts of issues that are detrimental not only ecologically, but certainly economically to the individual landowner, to the local wood products economy. So if there's any take-home message, it is become active managers of your forest, whatever your objective happens to be, if it's more conservation or more revenue generating, but take an active management